So by now, you've probably heard the news. You've also probably seen the few videos we've made about the newest Anaheim Ducks defender on the right side, John Klingberg. In my opinion, this was an absolute steal of a contract because for 1 year, $7 million, the Ducks are getting themselves a legitimate talent on their blue line. A guy who last season had 47 points in 74 games played for the Dallas Stars, despite the fact that you could very well say that he is no longer the best defenseman on that team. He is a few years removed from being a guy that some people would say deserved to be in the Norris conversation, but after an extended free agency period where he wanted a certain amount of money on the market, he didn't get it, and eventually the Anaheim Ducks were like, hey, so you want to just sign a 1-year deal with us? $7 million AAV, you can become a free agent next year and maybe try to get the bag then, after having a stellar season here in Anaheim, California, Disneyland. You could be mentoring Jamie Drysdale and you could probably help him become a good defender. He said yes to that. Well, it turns out that when it comes to what could have happened, other possibilities that presented themselves on the table, we have to go over onto the latest edition of the 32 Thoughts podcast to hear what Elliotte Friedman ended up saying. Now, I'll leave a link in the description if you want to go ahead and listen to the most recent episode of the show, but I'll also leave a link in the description to this article on NHLTradeTalk.com published by Colton Pankew the other day. Take a look at the title of this piece. The Oilers and the Habs discussed a sign and trade opportunity involving John Klingberg. In this article is the quote from Elliotte Friedman on the 32 Thoughts podcast. Before John Klingberg ended up in Anaheim, I do think that the Oilers were looking at Klingberg and they were trying to do something with another team, potentially Montreal, Friedman explained. Klingberg would sign there with the Habs and then get traded to Edmonton. Montreal would have retained a bit, and the Oilers would have added a sweetener, and maybe they'd have to move a player or two. I do think that was talked about. Now, this is actually really interesting because it kind of opens the door up to a new sort of pattern that we've only really started to see in the NHL this offseason. The sign and trade. Now, there are two ways to go out there and actually do the sign and trade effectively, wherein a player signs a contract with Team X, and then Team X immediately trades that player to Team Y. There are a multitude of reasons, but the main two I wanted to go over here in this video actually have some pretty good examples tied to them. The first sign and trade option is the one that we just saw right here with Klingberg. The Oilers wanted to sign Klingberg, but they didn't really have the money to go out there and afford his services, so if the Montreal Canadiens signed Klingberg instead, and then traded him over immediately to Edmonton with salary retained, the Oilers would say thank you. They would have to add on a sweetener, give the Canadiens an extra pick or a player or two, because, hey, the Habs are doing the Oilers a solid by taking on a certain amount of a Klingberg contract in order for the Oilers to take him on at a cheaper price. But then we have ourselves the other form of a sign and trade, where a team uses the 8-year window they have as an advantage to help out in negotiations. We saw this lately with Matthew Tkachuk, as he signed an 8-year extension with the Florida Panthers. Actually, scratch that, he did not sign an 8-year extension with the Panthers, he signed that extension with the Calgary Flames, but that contract immediately got flipped over to Florida, and the reason they did it like that is because, hey, if Tkachuk gets traded over to Florida, he cannot sign an 8-year deal, he can only sign a 7-year deal. So the Calgary Flames executed the very first sign and trade in the NHL's history, but it appears the Oilers, the Canadiens, and John Klingberg went out there and tried to get the second ever done just a few weeks later. So let's go over what exactly John Klingberg is and how he could have helped out the Oilers and what the Montreal Canadiens could have actually gained in this sort of a situation here. As we said off the top, Klingberg is a very legit, very offensively potent defenseman, and a few years ago, he actually did make a pretty good case at being a Norris caliber guy. He had 67 points in 82 games played in 2017-2018, and it was around this time where Klingberg really started to blossom as an offensive NHL guy. Now, when the Dallas Stars went to the Stanley Cup Finals in 2020, it wasn't just Klingberg that was an absolute stud on this blue line. You also had yourselves Miro Heiskanen, and if you take a look at the top playoff performers list for the Stars in the 2020 bubble playoffs, you'll see that number 1 and number 2 on the team were Heiskanen and Klingberg with 26 points and 21 points respectively in 27 and 26 games. Klingberg was an absolute superstar. It's just, he went out there and wanted a little bit too much money on whatever next deal he would be able to get, which is why he wasn't even able to get that contract in the first place, and he ended up signing a 1-year deal with the Ducks. Now for Edmonton, John Klingberg is honestly a really interesting kind of conversation to be having, and it's one that I don't really think makes the most sense, to be honest. Because when you go over the right side of the Oilers and their blue line, you'll already see two other offensively potent and capable guys in Evan Bouchard and Tyson Barrie. Now, both of these players play the right. Cody Ceci also plays the right too, so he's kind of the balancer out in that respect. But if you had to move out one of these three guys in order to make room for a John Klingberg, part of me says that, hey, you're probably not really going to get all too much value by trading away a Ceci, since, having three offensive guys in Barrie, Bouchard, and Klingberg would only do more harm than good when you consider just how much ice time is going to have to be split between these guys and who's going to be manning the power play, because Klingberg is a primary power play quarterback, and Evan Bouchard is supposed to be that in the future. Tyson Barrie is already supposed to be that, so unless you're going out there and trading away one of Barrie and or a Bouchard, which you're not going to go out there and do if you're Edmonton, to a Montreal Canadiens team in order to open up that roster space to get a Klingberg onto your squad, it doesn't really make too much sense to me in the first place for Klingberg to be going to the Oilers. But I guess maybe you could say the same thing about a lot of the other Oilers conversations we've been having. Oh, Phil Kessel, Patrick Kane, these are players that are very good and offensively capable, getting added to a forward core that's already good and offensively capable. You could just be trying to go out there and overloading everything. Oh, let's just go all offense all the time so we can outscore our problems and win games like 9-5. If we're scoring 9 goals a game, there's no way we could lose, right? It's an interesting philosophy, but it's one that I definitely do think has its flaws. As for the Montreal Canadiens, if you're going to go out there and say that any of the right-handed defensemen on the Oilers already, so a Ceci or a Barrie or a Bouchard, would be sent over to Montreal just to free up that roster space, I think the only one that Montreal Canadiens fans would actually get on board with is Evan Bouchard. No disrespect to Tyson Barrie, he probably would be a good Hab and he probably could produce a lot of offense, but that contract does expire soon. He's a UFA in 24-25, and he doesn't really do all too much outside of the offensive zone. He scores a lot of points, but that's about it. I guess the Montreal Canadiens might be able to use a guy that can just score points and everything, but at the end of the day, they're still trying to go out there and build a team that is competitive and that can actually grow and prosper into future success. And I just feel like a guy like Evan Bouchard would have a lot better of an opportunity of helping out that cause than a Tyson Barrie would, at least in the short term. Evan Bouchard as well is a very good young player, which I definitely do think is going to prosper into a solidified top 4 defenseman and a potential 40-50 point guy when he's in his prime, but the Oilers would definitely not want to go out there and ship that type of player out. And so with John Klingberg entering the conversation, it makes things very difficult to process in my opinion, but that's kind of just me. You can let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. What do you think about the idea of John Klingberg heading over to the Edmonton Oilers on a sort of sign and trade with the Montreal Canadiens? How that actually could have gone down in the record books, because it would have been the second ever sign and trade in the NHL's history, just following shortly after the Tkachuk, Florida, Calgary sign and trade, which was done a few weeks ago. Also, Ducks fans, I want to see what you think about this conversation too, because it probably was not as big of a hassle for you guys to sign him to a $7 million AAV one-year deal. So it might feel kind of humorous thinking about Edmonton and Montreal and saying, wow, they really wanted this guy. They were going to the point of maybe giving up some other sweetener, maybe another draft pick or a prospect or some other players to get this guy in a sign and trade. Meanwhile, we just got him for free because we signed him and that's it. John Klingberg was a pretty valuable asset on the NHL free agent market, but I guess it kind of confirms everything we thought earlier on, that he was just a little bit too valuable in his own eyes, because if the Oilers really wanted to get him, so much to the point that they probably had to go through a sign and trade type of process, it really illuminates just how much money he actually wanted, doesn't it? The guy was looking to get paid, but now he's going to have to wait until next season to go out there and get that contract, and it's going to be a little bit of a risk because we don't know how good the Anaheim Ducks are going to be next season. He's also going to be older in next year's free agency period, so maybe the Oilers go out there and circle back to Klingberg a year's time from now, but that remains to be seen. We'll see what happens once the calendar year comes and goes. Talk in the comments, though, all your thoughts, Oilers fans, Canadiens fans, and Anaheim Ducks fans, all your thoughts about the John Klingberg potential sign and trade. Links will be in the description to the NHL Trade Talk article, as well as the 32 Thoughts podcast. I hope you enjoyed this Juraj 99, and Bye.